Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Eric Way. I'm Director of Client Relationships at LexisNexis Canada. And welcome to this, the first of our technology and litigation discussion series. Today, we will talk about the impact and influence of artificial intelligence on the legal industry. We have seen and are seeing AI applied to many things around us, from our cars to our phones to business decision-making. How does AI apply to the law? What is it? Does it work? And where is it going? To answer those questions, we have with us today an expert panel, each with their own hands-on experiences and perspectives on the topic. In lieu of speaker gifts for this event, LexisNexis Canada will be making a $1,000 donation to the Indian Residential School Survivors Society, or IRSSS. Recent events have drawn renewed attention to the intergenerational trauma caused by Canada's residential school program. The IRSSS offers support to residential school survivors and their families. To learn more about the IRSSS and to support their work, please go to irsss.ca. Now, as I introduce our panelists for today, we'd like to take a quick poll of the audience. And the question we'd like you to answer for us is, have you personally applied artificial intelligence technology to your legal practice? Please tell us yes or no in the poll. And now to introduce our panel for today. First of all, we have with us Shelby Austin. A passionate builder and leader of teams and technology. Shelby Austin is a serial entrepreneur, recovering lawyer, and technology executive. Formerly head of Deloitte's AI practice, Omnia, Shelby is now CEO of the award-winning Arteria AI digital contracting software. Arteria AI works with large institutions to help them contract faster and smarter using data-first principles. Thank you for being with us, Shelby. Lachlan Caunt. Dr. Lachlan Caunt is director of the Better Justice Lab, an adjunct professor at Queen's Law, and the Tim Bates postdoctoral fellow in insurance law. He recently returned from Oxford, where he was an academic visitor at Keble College. He is fascinated by natural language processing and artificial intelligence and utilizes them regularly in his work at the Better Justice Lab. Welcome, Lachlan. Greg Lambert, librarian, lawyer, knowledge management, competitive analysis, computer programmer. Greg has taken the Renaissance man approach to working in the legal industry. As former president of the American Association of Law Libraries, co-founder of the Three Geeks and a Law blog, and co-host of the Geek and Review podcast, Greg is constantly looking at unrelated items and creating a process to tie those items together. Thanks for being with us, Greg. Angela Swan. With over 50 years in the legal profession, Angela Swan has expertly filled a number of roles, from professor to esteemed counsel. An award-winning author, renowned educator, and frequently cited scholar, Ms. Swan embodies what it means to be a jack of all trades in the field of law. As a result of her years of noted passion and drive, Angela is regarded as one of the most distinguished experts in Canadian contract law. Thank you, Angela. And finally, Paul-Erik Veel is a partner at Lenzner Slott. His diverse litigation practice is focused on complex commercial litigation, large multi-jurisdictional class actions, competition law, intellectual property, and professional liability. He is an advocate of using legal data analytics to inform the practice of litigation and achieve exceptional outcomes for his clients. Paul-Erik also developed and leads the Lenzner Slott Data-Driven Decisions program. So you can see we have an all-star panel for you today. Before we turn it over and get things started, do we have the first poll results? So we can see our audience answered 78% no to them having personally applied artificial intelligence to their practice. That's an interesting place to start. I would have expected actually a lower number of yes, because we're still in the early days, but we've got 22% that say yes, they have applied it in some way. Well, let's get things started. To kick off the conversation, I'd like to ask each panelist in turn to give a quick summary of their own perspectives and thoughts on today's topic, because you're all coming from different places. And some of you, if you'd like to react to this quote, which is from Forbes in 2019. Among the social sciences, law may come the closest to a system of formal logic. To oversimplify, legal rulings involve setting forth axioms derived from precedent, applying those axioms to the particular facts at hand, and reaching a conclusion accordingly. This logic-oriented methodology is exactly the type of activity to which machine intelligence can fruitfully be applied. So Shelby, why don't we start with you?
Sure. First off the mark, I'm nervous now. Where do I stand on this? Obviously, I'm the CEO of an artificial intelligence legal tech company. And so where I stand on this is that I am a huge fan. I believe that the future is only going one way. I also believe that the use of technology and artificial intelligence throughout the way law is approached is not just something that will absolutely happen. I believe it's a certainty and inevitability. And I also believe it's the right thing to do when used responsibly. In terms of reacting to the quote, I think that some of the nuances of law make it a perfect candidate for AI. I know some of my panelists disagree here and think that the historic nature of the precedents that we're feeding the artificial intelligence mechanism means that we will always end up at the same result. I think that shows a misunderstanding about artificial intelligence and how it works. And I think that when used properly and fed appropriate training guidelines and context, we should absolutely have the tool set of using artificial intelligence to help us understand legal precedents. I think it's a helpful tool. I think it can be much more contextualized these days than it ever has been in the past. And in addition, I think that we should never forget that we can always put a human in the loop to add additional assurance to that process. And so I won't continue on forever, but that's where I come to this challenge today, which is very bullish on technology, in particular, natural language processing and the use of law, of course, with responsible and guidelines and guardrails.
Lachlan, you want to pick it up from there?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm maybe not quite as bullish as Shelby, but still somewhat bullish. I definitely think that natural language processing in particular is of enormous assistance to law. I can think of an example from my academic work where I got every BC negligence decision from the last 20 years, got a team of 3, they spent 2 months, and rather than having to read all 5,000 decisions, they were able to run a bot, use NLP at quite an advanced level, and they were able to work out that damages have increased about 37% over the last 20 years without having to read more than maybe 100 to 200 of the cases to code for it. So I definitely think that AI has potential uses in legal research and legal writing. Whether it can functionally replace the decision maker, I obviously don't think the tech is there yet in all ways, but I think the future will be increasingly promising.
Great. Greg?
Thanks. And apologies, I had to switch to my iPhone. I'm actually on the road in the middle of Colorado, taking this from the road. So bear with me. Sorry.
Wow.
So I too am really bullish on it. I think the phrase that you'll hear a lot is that, and this has been around for a long time, is that AI plus a lawyer beats AI or a lawyer alone. And so, there's a number of things that people are probably using right now that use natural language processing or large data sets that have had experts work on those expert systems and just not realized it because it's become a part of your job now. And it's no longer this magical thing called AI. It's just a process that you're doing. And so, and I think a good example of that, and I got it from, I think it was either Alex Hudek or Noah Weisberg, was that now I've lost my train of thought there. With is that, it just becomes a part of the overall process that you're using, and that it's just one of those things where you can think of it as it's no longer magic, but rather just something that you use every day. And now I remember what they said. It's like arguing over your Google Assistant or Siri, which it uses AI techniques as part of the process there. You don't really think of that any longer as AI. It's just a part of your, it's built into your phone, and now you expect it to be there. And I think when it comes to the legal industry, a lot of your technically savvy customers, or the customers who are very price sensitive, will want you to apply these techniques, because again, with the artificial intelligence, that allows the lawyer to do what the lawyer does best, and that is use her brain to process complex legal issues, not write or draft first draft of a document. And so the whole process becomes just second nature to you.
Right. Angela, do you want to pick it up from there?
Sure. With respect to the quotation from Forbes, I couldn't agree less with it. It is wrong, and fundamentally wrong, and has been seen to be wrong for at least the last 100 years. It is an expression of formalism, and formalism in law has been rejected, as I said, for at least 100 years. Remind people that if rules are a result, there'd be no need for lawyers. I'd also say, to express my skepticism, that I believe in AI, at least to some extent more, if Microsoft can reliably capitalize the first letter of the first sentence, or the Globe and Mail and Microsoft can reliably and correctly hyphenate words. They can't do that, and so I'm deeply skeptical. I don't deny the role of AI in all kinds of things. But the principal problem I have with AI in law is that I think that people don't think about where to start to think about legal problems. Legal problems are not the application of rules. Legal problems arise in the context of an enterprise. Law is the enterprise of subjecting human conduct to rules. An enterprise can succeed or it can fail. Law of contracts, for example, is the enterprise of protecting people's expectations of those who rely on promises. And if you think about this, the purpose of application then is something that, looking at cases, cannot be dealt with on the cases alone, because the answers to come from outside the case. My text, my 1,000-page text, is an example of my attempt to do what I say has to be done. That is, to give reasons for results, and to criticize cases not because they're wrong in some point of detail, like following somebody's ratio or ignoring it, but because they fail to consider what the purposes of the law are. And so if you start from an inadequate conception of the law, which I'm afraid far too many people do, then I think you're doomed to fail, or at least to cause all kinds of problems. So when Shelby says, this is the future, I entirely agree that all kinds of things can be done. AI in diagnostics, for example, seems to be fantastic. I just am deeply worried about it in the context of law, because I think that at the moment, the people who are pushing this have an inadequate idea of what law is for.
Well, I'm going to give Shelby a chance to jump in on that again, but let's turn it over to Paul-Erik for his thoughts.
Thanks very much, and thanks for having me here today. So it's so interesting, this panel, because of course I agree with about 90% of what Angela says, but of course I then come to the exact opposite conclusion that she comes from. So I think the quote is wrong too, but that yields actually the answer as to why AI and machine learning is so powerful. So let's start off right off the hop on this. And let me just say the perspective I'm bringing to this is as a practicing lawyer, a practicing litigator who wants to understand to advise his clients better. That is to make sense of what a likely outcome in a case is, how the court is likely to rule, give my clients probabilities as to what's going to happen better than I have done before. The quote that you put on the screen previously is, Angela's right. It exemplifies a form of legal formalism that has been rejected for a very long time. I am a bit of a legal realist and think that judges engage in outcome-oriented reasoning all the time. You don't even have to be a legal realist, though, to recognize that there isn't pure formal logic at play. You only have to look at, the Supreme Court of Canada in the last 20 years, where we've moved from rule-based structures to flexible standards throughout, to recognize that there's, I would say, a high degree of discretion. And of course, we all know that judges are people with their own views and biases as well. They're not robots applying some system. And that's why AI is powerful. If law were just formal logic, we wouldn't need AI. We could just construct a computer program with a series of if-then statements to come to the conclusion. And the quote seems to imply that that's what AI is. It's just a series of if-then statements. It's not. The whole point about AI and why it's so powerful is that it can, as Greg said, recognize patterns either in unstructured data like natural language processing or large structured data sets to yield insights about what's going to happen. And that's precisely why I think AI has so much promise in this area, because it can do what computer formal logic can't in actually trying to predict outcomes. And I'll just say very quickly, and then I'll stop talking. What we've been doing, I think, is a perfect example of where AI can be a really interesting complement to conventional analysis. So we have this program called the Supreme Court Leave Project, where we try and predict what the likelihood is of any case getting leave to the Supreme Court of Canada. And the idea is, if we know the likelihood of cases getting leave, we can give better advice to our clients about whether they should bother with a leave application. The Supreme Court doesn't give reasons. You can't try and back out the formal logic of whether the court will grant leave or not. But as it turns out, when you build a big data set with over 100 variables in that data set and you train it on enough data, you can get some pretty good and pretty consistent predictions that you can use to actually advise your clients better. So I am very bullish on AI. I'm very bullish on machine learning, precisely because law isn't amenable to the formal logic that quote implies.
Well, I love that we're off to a running start here with a couple of provocative perspectives on here. And Shelby, I want to turn it back to you. I mean, to respond to this, but also maybe going from the more conceptual to something more concrete. And Paul-Erik already mentioned one of the applications. Well, what do you have to say to that? And then could you also speak to, as somebody who's worked at a couple of AI companies, when we talk about AI, what are some of the potential applications? If we take sort of the non-technical definition of AI as applying machines to legal tasks, what are we actually talking about? And feel free to react to what's already been said as well.
I'm not sure I have too much to add to what's already been said. I think it's a great point that AI is not a series of rules. I think that really needs to be understood. I think there are many examples, the most famous of which was from the Netflix movie about AlphaGo, where actually the AI came up with a new move in the game rather than one that had been seen before. It's a bit of a trite example because it's so well known, but there you have it. Listen, Arteria serves as a great example as one form of AI. What we do is we help the world contract faster by, in some cases, automating parts of the negotiation process. And what's interesting to note, and I think why it serves as an interesting example, is that we're not taking jobs that are done by lawyers. In most cases, the contracts that we're looking at are contracts that are not negotiated by lawyers. They're done by other job types within large financial organizations, be that in operations or, a whole staff of negotiators or compliance folks. And so it's quite a different way of conceptualizing the problem. And so I think there's no doubt we've seen AI applied to legal research, potentially to judgments, though I'm skeptical of that, not because I don't think that the AI can work as a tool, but because I think that, as Canadians, we often have a right to attend before the court, and I feel strongly about that. And so Angela and I don't disagree on as much as you might think. But I think that, pleadings, of course, and all aspects of litigation. But I also think we forget that AI can be used to help understand workflows, and it can be used to help direct process improvements and speed. And so even if we don't get into some of the more controversial substantive parts of the use of AI, we can still use it to be quite a bit more efficient in how we do things. And so I would just say that I think that AI will be used in every single aspect of practice, as it should be. I like your definition, and I'll close on this, which is that AI is really automating tasks that used to be done by humans. I think it's the right one, because I think the way we have to think about it for those of us who are newer to the subject matter is, where are my problems? What's annoying? What takes me too long? What's hard to do? Is it reviewing documents? Is it looking at contracts? Is it reviewing pleadings? What is hard and difficult for me to do? And how can I make myself a little bit more efficient? And just really looking at it as one more tool to solve traditional problems in the legal practice.
Yeah. Well, this is probably a great segue, Lachlan. You mentioned NLP in your bio and introduction. And we have a question about, can somebody actually explain what is the application? I know Shelby and Eric have mentioned both on the predictive analytics side and the contract analytics. Maybe you could pick that up, Lachlan, and talk about maybe some other applications. Maybe define for us what NLP is and how that relates to AI as well.
Sure. So that's a really interesting question, and thanks for it. What we do at the Better Justice Lab is we're a data-driven access to justice lab, and we have sort of two limbs. And the first limb is we try and find access to justice problems as they exist. And what we do is we use natural language processing to read largely unstructured data from pretty much wherever anybody goes on the internet to ask legal questions. So we use natural language processing. We build our data lake first, and then we use natural language processing to interrogate everything within that data lake to work out if people are asking questions that relate to family problems or housing or consumer or debt or any of those sorts of things. And we're actually able to use NLP at quite a successful level to work out that generally people are looking at housing and employment questions first and foremost at quite a high level of certainty. We're able to throw out pie charts and look at them and interrogate the sub-content of those pie charts and say that people are looking at these problems, and then we pass it on to our second half of the lab, which solves those problems. So NLP and machine learning can be really useful in dealing with really unstructured, really messy data like Reddit posts or Twitter forums or whatever. So there is a lot of hope for NLP and legal tech, legal analytics for the future.
Greg, can I turn it over to you? Talk about some applications. And also, I didn't give a chance for any of you to react. How do you react to the poll result of 22% of our audience saying that they have already used AI in their practice? Is that higher, lower, about right?
Well, I would say it's probably a little low in my view, but I think it's also because of what's defined as AI. So I would say that there's a number of legal research programs that I've used for years that have aspects of AI being used on the back end. And so I don't know if they want to count that. So if they've used any type of major legal research product, they have probably used AI. They just don't realize it because it's built in to the system now. The one thing that I wanted to point out, and I think a lot of it goes back to AI doing a lot of the grunt work, and I'm sure the same goes in Canada as it does down here in the States, is that we have a huge sector of our population that needs legal help, that needs a lawyer, but cannot get that because I think the lawyers are, it's just too expensive. It's too complicated. It's too time consuming. And It doesn't really matter if it's, you know, a middle-class person needing a divorce or criminal representation, or it's a huge corporation. All of those have these unfilled legal needs that they're not doing because it's either time consuming or expensive, or they don't realize that it's a need. And then the AI process, I think, is if attorneys apply it correctly, or even if it's those who are not attorneys apply it correctly, you're going to see that that's going to help open up the need, or fill that need, rather, for the people to come in with more legal needs, because now you can either lessen the cost or lessen the time or lessen the complexity of that by applying AI to the process, not using it completely, but rather just assisting the person providing the legal help to do the job faster, cheaper, and easier.
Yeah, well, you raise an interesting point. I think both you and Lachlan raise an interesting perspective about the access to justice implication of AI. And I just want to turn it back to you, Angela. You know, having heard that, does that change your perspective, add to your perspective on what the technology could do?
I think that obviously, you know, access to justice problems are really horrible. I mean, a lot of people are not served by for all kinds of reasons. And I'm not against AI so much as I have concerns about it. For example, I can give you a whole bunch of I can give many examples where courts have made absolutely straight errors, absolutely dead wrong. And because of the way in which for example, CanLII works, those cases will be picked up and they'll be followed, even though the statement made in the initial case is as wrong as it can be. And for various quirks of reporting and so on, very often the Court of Appeal decision reversing it isn't found. So I'm not against AI in terms of it can deal with these problems. I'm just deeply skeptical about the way in which AI is structured at the moment. I don't know how natural language processing, for example, can possibly deal with the fact that this decision disappoints the expectations of one of the parties for no good reason. Okay, for example, if I use a CanLII and I do a search in CanLII, I get CanLII's assessment of the most relevant case. I have no idea how that decision is made. I never look at that most relevant case. I look at other criteria that I have. Maybe because I have my experience, I'm not starting out from a blank slate. But I worry about the things that are behind it, which are not disclosed, because many natural language processing, it doesn't really matter what the result is. But in law, it really does matter. For example, I mean, my daughter's a litigator, and I told her of a recent decision of the Court of Appeal, and her comment was, that's the special facts. That case is not part of what will become anybody's catalog of cases to be considered, because an experienced lawyer says no court's going to follow it because of its special facts, and those special facts are almost never going to reoccur.
That's actually a great segue to bring Paul-Erik into this as we transition to the next question, which is the state of technology. Does it work? And Paul-Erik, you've got data-driven decisions team at Lenzers. You talked about one of the tools that you have. Can you speak to that? How do you actually use it in practice? Are there limitations? How do you navigate things like what Angela has raised? Is that, how do you sift out the exceptional from the things that are really relevant?
So I guess let me react to that in a couple of ways. So first, I think it's very important that we calibrate what the benchmark for success for AI is. AI is another tool that we can use. And if what we compare AI to is, for example, a textbook or some of the software platforms that we've been using for years, that's a good measure. I don't think the proper measure is to say, how does AI do as compared to someone like Angela, who's been practicing for as long as she's been practicing and is a subject matter expert? It would be great if every Canadian had their own personal Angela to give the view of what the law is and how things should be done, but that's not realistic. So for my part, a good benchmark for AI is, can it do the job pretty well? And by pretty well, I mean, is it sufficiently good to either be better than no expert at all, or B, can it add to the expertise that a lawyer brings to it? And I think the answer to that is absolutely yes. And let me just give you 2 examples. So first, in the project that we've been undertaking on our side of the Supreme Court Leave database, number one, although I haven't done a person versus machine competition, I actually think that our model would do pretty well against an expert lawyer predicting which cases get leave. So that's thing one. Thing two is on something like document review, which is something we haven't talked quite as much about, but is a big part of the AI work that's happening right now. Computer-assisted, technology-assisted review has been a part of the landscape for years. It has done a fantastic job of helping us identify documents at substantially lower cost to clients in a practical sense. Will it pick up 100% of relevant documents? Absolutely not. Will it sometimes miss things? Absolutely. Do lawyers sometimes miss things? Absolutely. So the point is, you can get essentially, with something like technology-assisted review, which is another application of AI, you can get very, very, very good accuracy at a fraction of the cost of paying an army of lawyers to look through those documents. So I think there are predictive analytics and document review are, to my view, 2 of the most obvious places where we're going to see this a lot. You know, once we start getting even further down the pipeline to things like automated decision making, or actually automating the process by which an adjudicator decides on something, we get into much, much, much thornier issues. We can talk about that, but I think that raises fundamentally different rule of law type issues. But when we're talking about tools to assist a lawyer, the tools are already out there and they work pretty darn well in my view.
And those are 2 tools, the 2 you mentioned. You've got those integrated in your practice: technology-assisted review, the leave application predictor. You're actually using those on your files right now.
Absolutely. And let me give you technology-assisted review. More people here probably know about, but let me give you an example of the leave. Sorry?
I think Shelby. I mean,
fair enough.
I was going to turn it at somebody, but finish your thought.
Let me just say, sorry, and then I'll stop talking. I know I have a habit to talk far too much, but let me just say this very quickly. So with our leave application predictor, one of the ways you can use it, the reaction I've gotten from some people is, well, look, a smart lawyer can figure out whether a case is likely to get leave. But it's a good second opinion for checking our biases, right? So I may have been working on a case for many years and think it may be a great case to go to the Supreme Court of Canada because it raises all these interesting issues. When our model comes along and says, gee, you've actually got a 2% chance and we got a pretty reliable model, that's a check for me to say, well, wait a second, why am I so optimistic when the model is giving me a very, very low prediction? Again, it's not determinative. It's not dictating what we do, but it's another tool we can use to give better advice to our clients. And sorry, Shelby, I didn't mean to take up what you were going to say or what anyone else was going to say on that.
It was my inclination to turn over any document review issues, I think, Shelby, just based on your background, to see what your reaction was to that, particularly about technology-assisted e-discovery.
You know, I think Paul-Erik has always said it, you know, better than I could. I think the fact is, even in my career, the, I don't know, hundreds of millions of documents the teams I have led have looked at, there aren't enough humans or practicing lawyers to have looked at them. And so the question is it more just for the court to have access to those documents that could never have been found by humans or not? In my view, the answer is very similar to a lot of the folks on this panel. We are not trying to replace lawyers by any stretch of the imagination. We're replacing tasks. In the most part, we're replacing really boring tasks. I've made my career making boring tasks, automated and with the use of AI and technology in order to make the world more efficient and effective. And so I think if we look at it through that lens, there are simply not enough lawyers to do the work that's required. I think there are some great questions in the chat, if you're okay with me taking one, which is like, how do we think about natural language processing, and people understand that they're sort of like looking at keywords, but how do you take that to the next level of really using it in a predictive way? I think, again, the substantive issues, could you use it to predict how a judge will rule? Absolutely. Could you use it to predict, as Lensner-Slat's doing, where someone will get leave? Absolutely. There are lots of sort of more active ways, but in addition, could you help advise your client better by saying, in these kinds of cases, here's how much money it takes to get to settlement versus here's how much money it costs to decide it. If we think again about it on its flip side, maybe we lower down some of the risk, but actually provide tremendous value to our clients in terms of all sorts of applications. So I just throw that out there as sort of a twist in saying that sometimes we're always looking for substantive efficiency, which absolutely can be gained as a tool for lawyers, not as a final decision. But in addition, there is just like tons and tons and tons of low-hanging fruit about how to provide more efficient, effective, and value for your clients by using predictive tools to assist in that way.
Can I add just a quick thought to that? Is that I've heard, I think at least once, maybe twice now, that the natural language process is basically keyword searching, kind of the old Boolean searching that us librarians are so good at. And that is just not the case. It's not, and one good example is a product that Google has open source called BERT, B-E-R-T. And that is much more of a conceptual type search or indexing rather than just keywords, or rather than just throwing a thesaurus and pretending that it's a human trying to, oh, well, if it's this word, it means this word. It rather looks at concepts based on the whole holistic view of the documents, the language that's used, and then can compare things that may not have similar keywords at all, but have the same concepts on there. And so that allows you to find potential, at least on the legal research side, some potential results that come back using the concepts rather than the keywords that you would not have found otherwise. And so thus making you a better researcher.
Yeah, Greg, thanks for jumping in and clarifying that. I was actually going to ask you, Greg, whether there was anything you saw as the lone American on this, and maybe it's a false assumption, but the assumption that with the larger market and firms down there, they may be a little bit ahead of us. Is there something you've seen down there that we haven't yet covered here, which might be a little more cutting edge, whether it uses NLP or some other aspect?
Quite frankly, I was trying to figure out a way to say this without sounding like I'm trying to kiss up, but a lot of my Canadian friends are there are companies that are coming out of Canada, and you can think of things like, and sorry, I know this is a Lexis hosted thing, but Clio, you can look at MLex, there's some other products out there, even Noah Weisberg is in Toronto. There is a ton of Canadian companies that are coming into the United States and selling us highly advanced AI technology. I do think there are a number of things that are happening out in Silicon Valley with the fintech industry that is bleeding over into the legal tech. And I think a lot of that is looking at processes, and one clear example is while I was sitting here, I got a note from Robinhood letting me know that my stock went down about 20%. And I mean, that was a task. That was something that I, as a person, could never just go out and buy and sell stocks directly. And so I think there's a number of things that the fintech industry, and most of that's coming out of Silicon Valley, is going to teach the legal tech industry on things that it can be self-help or some kind of assistance to get people to a certain point where they can get at least some of their legal needs taken care of. So, if you're looking for specifics, I think that for NLP, I think what Google's doing with BERT and Case Text is a company that's applying that, and they're out of Silicon Valley. I think they are doing some amazing stuff when it comes to, and it's not just case law or statutes. They're pointing at internal documents. They're pointing it at time entry. There's a number of things that can be done to help simplify the overall process that lawyers and others in the industry have to go through.
Yeah. Lachlan, I wonder if I could bring you in here. I think, Greg did a great job jumping in to clarify for some in the audience who may not understand what NLP is, but as someone who just embarked on that project, you said you used NLP to actually look at all of this unstructured data online about where the legal needs were. Could you jump in, maybe clarify that for us and take it down a level? What is it? How did you actually use it in your application?
Sure. So natural language processing, I generally think of is something that's looking at conversations and conversational patterns and extracting salient data points from that. So you can do it at a basic Boolean level, which is totally correct that NLP is so much more than Boolean search, but you can do it at a basic level and look to see how often the words consumer or how often home insurance or how often criminal comes up, and that's the most basic level. But you can also look at slightly higher levels and look at contextual words. You can look at how words are used. You can look at sentence structures. You can look at basically all of the pieces that humans use to communicate with each other, and you can analyze those. You can do things called sentiment analysis. So you can do quite a bit within NLP that's beyond that basic Boolean search, and you can in some ways replicate how people communicate. Chatbots have always been a pretty controversial and vexing thing, and they have issues of outputs and inputs, but natural language processing can do some decent enough at this juncture mimicry of how people converse and can extract from conversations the information that we want in a way that we could never do if we were just reading these Reddit threads or Twitter threads or ClickLaw threads or whatever. So natural language processing, I'm reasonably bullish about it. And I think that it allows us to do something that would otherwise be impossible.
Well, there's a related question in the chat. What kind of data did you actually look at in your project? It sounds like there was a whole lot of stuff, but maybe give us an idea of how broad you cast your net.
Yeah, so basically we use Google Analytics to look at where people search and where people get directed on their searches. And Margaret Hagan down at Stanford in the US has sort of said that Reddit is the unofficial legal advice sort of place for people in the US to go. And that's something that's stunning to lawyers. They would never think of Reddit as a legal advice location, but we look all the way through every comment posted in Reddit, the subreddit Legal Advice Canada. We'll look through all of our Twitter data, which is our next project. We'll look at ClickLaw, pretty much anything where anybody has input text into a text box and that's been posted publicly. That's what we look at.
Wow. Now, Shelby, did you want to jump in with something?
Well, I was just going to say, everyone's absolutely right in the way they're talking about using BERT models. And for those who are less familiar with it, you should check them out because the use of transformers in natural language processing has fundamentally changed the field in the past 24 months. So if you're thinking about the way natural language processing was used 2 years ago, you're thinking about it differently. And just to give you a sense, Arterium, when we're trying to understand contracts, is trained on the entire English language, sometimes on the entire language base of other languages. And then from there, we go ahead and we send Bert to law school and we make him Berteria and we start training him on every single public contract we can find on the internet. And that could be huge public corpuses and then more specifically for certain needs as well. So we're talking about, basically the model's ability and I'm saying the model because we're typically using transfer learning at this point to enhance our learning across models, but it's just, really just the corpus is huge. You can't imagine the size of the data and the size of the knowledge base on which these models are making decisions. Certainly more than I can hold in my little brain.
Right. Wow. Just picking up a couple of other questions in the chat, and it's a great segue because our next area is obviously what some of us have been waiting for, professional and ethical concerns. I think these have already been touched upon, and we got a specific question in the chat about sort of lack of transparency and not knowing sort of how the black box works. But I want to give Angela a chance to jump in here and maybe let us know specifically. We've heard a lot about the technology, different applications, a lot of the potential places. Angela, maybe you could get us started with professional ethical concerns. I think you voiced a few of them in terms of the formalistic approach. How do you feel about some of these other things, like the chat, the question about lack of transparency about how it all works?
Well, let me do two things. First of all, please don't understand me as being opposed to AI and things like document review, because obviously that can be done and can be as good or better than what lawyers do. So I'm not opposed to it. But let me raise another issue which touches on the ethical issues here. One of the problems of having a judicial process, which is characterized by two things: the right of the parties to present facts. Okay, so the clients call evidence, parties to tell a story. And secondly, the right of the parties to make arguments. Okay, and so the consequence of those two things is that judges themselves must not find the facts. They mustn't investigate facts other than those put before them by the parties. And secondly, judges must not consider arguments not raised by the parties. It happens occasionally. Supreme Court is a bad offender in this. It very often decides cases on grounds not raised by the parties at all. But the problem will be if a judge goes off and uses some method for getting cases which the parties haven't considered. I've written about it in kind of internal memos, sometimes in published papers. But for example, the English courts are much, much more concerned than we are about what a judge can properly look at and how it should be considered. And so I worry about, I got some postings on SLAW, I think, on this. So I worry about the application of AI in the judicial process, because if the judge does it on her own, we don't know what criteria or what she's considering. So that raises one big issue. The ethical one, I suppose, basically is, the ordinary one of lawyers' obligation to give clients value for money. If a lawyer can do the job more quickly by using AI, it should be done to save the client money.
Well, Paul-Erik is somebody who does have an analytics tool. First of all, I want to ask you, are you aware of any judges using that kind of a tool? And what are your thoughts on what Angela raised about it being a different way of perhaps undermining the judicial process?
So I agree with everything Angela just said. When we get into the process of actually making a decision, we don't only care about the result being the right one in some sense. We care about the public justification and transparency that comes with a judge setting out her or his reasons for decision and having made that decision on the basis of the record presented by the parties. And so when we talk about problems like the black box problem, the fact that you may have AI tools that you can't really understand how the inputs are related to the output, or sometimes even what the inputs are, that is a huge problem when we're dealing with judging. And I will profess that I have concerns about judges doing exactly that or replacing judges in some sense. Now, on the flip side of that, again, I think every judge out there uses tools like Canly and QuickLaw and Westlaw that have AI built into them already. So it's not as though they're not doing those things to some extent, Where we start having a problem in the adjudicative sphere is when the actual decision making, either the decision making is being deferred to the AI or the reasoning is being deferred to the AI. So as long as we stay well back of that, I don't think there are significant problems. And then for the individual lawyer, I'll just say this very quickly. Again, there was a question in the chat, which is a very good one, which is, well, what if a lawyer gives bad advice based on bad AI? Is the lawyer liable? Who do you sue? If a lawyer gives bad advice based on a faulty textbook right now, the lawyer's still liable. They can't just say, well, the textbook said X, and so I'm exonerated. If the textbook was garbage, they're still the ones on the hook. So again, if we conceive of AI as a tool, we don't run into these problems. Where we have a problem is AI completely purporting to supplant what someone does.
Do you think that, is that a real worry right now in terms of the impact on the judges when you talk about supplanting that? How do we stay well back from us even unconsciously creeping towards that seeping into the process?
I'm curious for other folks' thoughts on this, and it may be that others are. Let me just say very quickly on this one. I think we're still far enough back from that that's not something we have to. There's a few examples of this being used in the U.S. right now that has some problems. I think in Canada we're far enough back from that's not a discussion that we need to answer the questions on right now. I think 5 to 10 years from now, we are going to have to start grappling with it, but I'm not sure. Maybe others disagree with that.
Yeah, well, maybe I can ask Lachlan or Greg to answer it either in the Canadian context, or if you two have some international experience. Other countries, are they grappling with this? Are they concerned about
it? I know here in the US, I think the problem at the moment, maybe we may turn Angela's example on its head, in that instead of the judges using the AI to come up with perhaps a decision that they introduce facts otherwise not in evidence, instead what I think is making them upset is that the AI is being turned on them. And especially with some of the companies that are saying, well, this judge, if you get to her after lunch, you don't want to do this because, I mean, it's just crazy. Some of the things that some of the tools are trying to predict. And it's a number of the judges are upset that they are the subject of the AI rather than the user of the AI. So, but I think Angela's quite right that we need to be careful to understand that AI is still a tool and is not a decision maker. It is not a rule changer. If the rules are that the judge can only accept the evidence that is presented in her court, then those are the rules. It doesn't matter what the AI does. The judge has to follow the rules as well. Now, as this becomes much more ubiquitous, maybe that changes, but I don't think that's a serious concern, a real concern now. It may be more of a theoretical concern.
What can the judges do about their unhappiness about being the target of analytics? Is there anything they can do?
Let me tell you a story, if I may, Eric. Sid Peck was then at Osgoode Hall. He died recently. Very sorry to hear that he had died. Did a study a long time ago, I'm going to say in the 1960s, picking up an analysis of the Supreme Court's judgments and which judge decided what. This so offended the Supreme Court at the time, they retained John Cartwright, who had just retired as Chief Justice, to see if he could prosecute Sid Peck for contempt of court. Cartwright's advice was, well, this isn't a good idea. Okay, so it meant nothing. But that was the story I heard, that the court was so upset by the analytics that they wanted to prosecute Sid Peck for contempt of court. So there have been reactions. I don't know what the reaction is going to be to the recent LexisNexis offering, to tell the judge what cases she likes, or I don't know, maybe what dog she's fond of, or movie she likes. I don't know. But I worry about that, because we have to, maybe it's an illusion, to hang on to the belief that judges decide the case before them honorably, honestly, and with an attempt to do justice. And the judges I know a lot of judges, are consistent in their efforts to do what they think is right, and they're conscious of the things that they do and what their effect might be.
Well, that's
Just
interesting. Yeah, go
just
ahead.
on that, I need to react to that. So it's so interesting. You know, some countries like France have gone all the way to banning judicial analytics, which strikes me as absolutely insane, because of course we somehow accept that it's perfectly okay for lawyers to pore over judicial decisions and dissect them and analyze them and even analyze whole sets of them. But suddenly, once we start looking at them through a computer or using data to do that in ways that a person can't do, somehow all of the important language that comes out of the Supreme Court of Canada about the need for transparency and intelligibility and open courts and all of that goes out the window when it's something arguably different or better than a person looking at those decisions. This is something look, I do know as a practical matter, many judges are irritated by it, and this has been addressed in some other countries very harshly. But this just goes with the process of adjudication being a public institution. Judges must be amenable to criticism of the process by which they reach their decisions. If they're not, the whole system breaks down and we ultimately lose trust in the long run. Sorry for jumping in, but that's I'm enraged by the reaction that I've heard from some. Not Angela. I'm not enraged to your reaction. Just the adverse reaction that some courts and judges have had to this.
I mean, Paul-Erik, I completely agree with you. I'm not opposed to it. I'm just telling you the story of the Supreme Court, how it reacted, and it was the good sense of Cartwright to say, "Forget it, get over it, suck it up."
Yeah.
If I can just approach this from a different angle, from a technology angle, I think that we're leaving on the table a bunch of other concerns around the ethics of the AI itself. And so I think just to layer on, these are all great points about, whether or not it's moral or good or right to use these in a litigation context. But in addition, I think we need to be aware of who's at the table as we're building the AI. I think we have to ensure that we're using the best trusted AI practices in order to build appropriate AI. I think there has been tons of studies around diversity being at the heart of that. In addition, I think we need to use responsible AI principles. We need to ensure that we're really locking up things like data drift, and we're really locking them down, and that we're appropriately supervising our models. We shouldn't just be sort of building them willy-nilly and thinking that they stay the same. I think we need to make sure that we're testing them appropriately. And then finally, I think that someone in the chat mentioned a great point around explainability and are we comfortable with sort of the black box nature of AI? The last point I'll add to here is I think we need to contextualize that and nuance it a bit. Number one, if we're looking for a needle in a haystack, I'm not sure why the back end matters. Like if you're trying to find a document in a billion documents and you happen to find it, whether or not you use a wish or an AI, it doesn't really matter how you find it because you found it. And I think that that's a completely different problem than where we're actually trying to attempt to make a judgment or an adjudication on something where the back end absolutely does matter. I will say that the field is evolving quite a bit in terms of explainability in AI and how we're actually being able to visualize the weights within the models to actually help understand that a little bit better. But I also say that right now, I certainly feel more comfortable, as do most people who try and practice responsible and trusted AI, which I think is a hallmark of Canada, if I can be so bold, is to ensure that humans are appropriately in the loop. So, leave you with thoughts on sort of from a technical perspective on that.
Yeah, I think we kind of went off on the really interesting point about the reaction of the judges, but there are, as you mentioned, a whole bunch of other issues. I mean, I think when I was preparing the outline, the first two concerns were things that you had raised, Shelby, about the lack of transparency, the data, the algorithm bias, and I think we could talk about that. I think, Lachlan, just bring you back in. You're teaching at law school right now. Mm-hmm. What are the conversations you're having with the law students about this, whether from the concerns and, where is this all going, or much more practically, you're telling them that they have to come to grips with it?
Yeah, the reality is law schools, and Angela may or may not disagree with me on this, law schools are not always the most pedagogically progressive institutions that we may always want them to be. We're in the 21st century now, and we still cite to pre-AI decisions, pre-AI ways of thinking. Former Chief Justice Beverly McLaughlin has a great quote from some time ago comparing how a law office works 100 years ago to how an operating theater worked 100 years ago. And the differences between the two are quite seismically different. So when I'm teaching, I try and teach people those skills that relate to working side by side, working hand in hand with AI or with other skills. But I also teach, I teach torts and insurance mostly. So I teach black letter law. So I'm not integrating those tools into my pedagogy in a way that perhaps I would always like to. So legal research is something that AI is really looms large in, and I teach according to AI being a part of legal research. But when it comes to deciding whether case A plus B leads to a prediction in case C, I'm still teaching it using hundreds of year-old legal reasoning, inductive, deductive reasoning. I'm still teaching using old-fashioned models, not AI-driven modeling.
Are you having any of these sort of professional and ethical concern discussions yet at the law school level?
Not so much, not so much. There is law schools, or at least the law schools that I've taught at, aren't so twigging about the awareness of ethical concerns in AI. They're discussions that faculty members have between each other, but not in the classroom. It really hasn't bubbled up quite yet. I think in 2, 5, 10 years it will, but I think that still law schools are not as far ahead, I think, as the panelists would be on this.
Okay. Well,
Eric, in my teaching, yeah. my teaching, I think, I hope I'm consistent intellectually. What I've said here, and my teaching in my text. The fundamental difference that I have with most parents looking at case books and so on, is that for me, a case is an example of a problem and a solution to it. As such, the important question is whether the solution is a good one or a bad one. I do not consciously mention the word ratio in any class discussion I have. I want the students to focus on problems and solutions. And you may see two cases coming up with perhaps the same problem and different solutions, which case we decide which is the better one. But my problem is I do not talk in terms of deduction from previous cases. As I've said earlier, the very first thing, I reject utterly the formalist approach to law. And so I hope to teach people that you have to understand the problem, and then you understand the law.
Great. Now, I realize I forgot one of the polls, but it's really timely. Why don't we pause here? The second poll for the audience, I think it's actually right on point. Probably should have asked this 10 minutes ago. To ask the audience whether they agree with this statement, and I think maybe I can turn it to you guys too. So the statement is, the benefits of applying AI to the legal process will ultimately outweigh any professional or ethical concerns. And we're going to ask the audience to answer this on a scale of 1 to 4, from strongly disagree to strongly agree. And while we're giving them a few minutes to do that, does anybody want to chip in on what's your reaction to this?
Let me jump in, Eric. I'm sorry, I feel very strongly on this. If it outweighs professional or ethical concerns, it must be stopped. It must not outweigh ethical concerns. They are
the benefits. I think the question was, do you believe that ultimately the benefits will outweigh the professional?
It must not outweigh ethical concerns. They are the foundation of a legal practice and a lawyer's professional responsibilities. The question is badly worded. It cannot outweigh those concerns.
I agree with the wording on the questions. I'm hoping people.
Well, I'll take full responsibility for that.
The other way that I looked at it is that you cannot throw potential ethical concerns in order to just throw roadblocks up to keep any advancement in AI out of the system, because it may theoretically cause this type of issue or this type of issue. And so I think a lot of times we worry about it being perfect before we can implement it. And I think that may not be the way that we should be looking at it. It should be, obviously, if it does raise or break ethical rules, then it should be stopped. But if it's just someone may think that it may eventually cause an ethical rule violation, well, then I think maybe we should be looking at the processes and be prepared to address that as the time is right for it. But allow the AI, allow the improvements in the processes to be there. And then when you do see a solid issue, that it be addressed, hopefully before it becomes an issue, but but not just because it may theoretically cause a problem, years down the line, or to a certain fact set that may never occur.
Anyone else want to jump in on that before we take a peek at the results?
I'm going to make both a bold statement and a completely timid statement. The bold statement is, I don't think there's any professional or ethical concern that can't be addressed or mitigated appropriately in the context of using AI by lawyers as part of legal practice. So I think we can address it there. The timid statement is, when it comes to actually doing that assessment in the adjudication context, should judges be using AI along with things, beyond sort of the basic AI they're using right now? I have no idea. That's a whole separate discussion, and I genuinely don't know where I land on that issue. But for practicing lawyers, I think absolutely we can address all of the potential ethical issues that could arise.
So you would fall on the strongly agree side of that, right?
Yeah, right. Assuming that we understand, strongly agree, not to be that I don't think ethical obligations are important. I do. I completely agree with Angela and Greg.
And I do take Angela's perspective that the question may not be the most clearly worded. Anybody else want to weigh in before we take a peek to see what the audience thinks? Well, why don't we go and do that? Alex, what? Oh, somewhat agree is the leading answer at 42%. I don't know if you can see it. So we have somewhat agree at 42%, somewhat disagree at 27%, and then the extremes are only 18 and 13. So I don't know what to make of that, but I think we've had a really lively discussion.
Yeah,
about
that's 60-40. I think that's a pretty good split, I think.
Do you think that's what you'd see in the US as well?
Yeah, I think you would see very similar in the US.
Okay. So just with the time I have left, we can do a couple of things. Why don't we look at a couple of the chat questions? I know some of you have been looking at those and answering those on the fly. Why don't we try to take a couple of those questions, and then we'll just have a few minutes. I'll ask you to wrap up. Alex, can you throw up a couple of the chat questions and see? Is there anything any of you see in the chat that you'd like to raise at this point? Why don't we start there? Alex, can you open it up? Let's have a look here. Let's see. Maybe scroll down a little bit.
I'm happy to take one from Amy on how good natural language processing is now, if that's helpful.
Yeah, go ahead.
So I think her question was like, how good is NLP these days? And I think the answer is, not only are we seeing better fundamental models being put out by Google and others. I think someone mentioned the GPT-3 in the chat, which is also a good one. We're also seeing the advent of better techniques around that. So in addition to having fundamentally better algorithms, we're using much more data and filling any gaps there. And in addition, we're also using multimodal models and transfer learning to enhance the output. And so I would just say, in short, and sort of for the less technical part of the crowd, the techniques are getting really good. for the first time in my career, and I work in technology, so I don't often see something that makes my jaw drop. I have seen zero-shot learning, meaning where something is not actually trained, but you ask a series of text to question and it gives you an answer. I've seen zero-shot techniques and low-shot techniques really be quite promising, more than I've ever seen them in the past. So I would say, as someone who sees technology and natural language every day and deploys models every day, I'm astounded by how far the technology has come and how quickly it's moving. So are there weaknesses? Sure, there are always weaknesses. I think we still have, I think there's still, we're getting better in multi-language models, but I think, there are still challenges there. I think there are still nuances for sure across the board. And I think this idea that we can commit early to models and keep them improving rather than requiring perfection from the outset is really a required sort of understanding and change concept. But I would just say that, that we are getting better, better models, better techniques, better data. And then just to top it off with one question from Cheryl in the chat, which is about the cost. Because we are getting better on all of these fronts, we're also managing to skinny the models quite a bit and to use much less power, which is great from an environmental perspective, but also, we're being able to really get much more efficiency from the models. So we're seeing, we're seeing great promising sort of events there as well. So happy to chat these through with anyone who's curious, but really I am blown away by the improvements.
Yeah, and I think we could probably keep this going for another hour or so, but we can't. Hitting up against our deadline now. I did get a note here that we are going to keep this conversation going sort of offline on LinkedIn and Twitter and through some of the emails with our attendees. We'll share some of the questions with our panelists. But before I thank everybody, I will go around if there's any quick closing remarks. Lachlan, we start with you.
I think the future is an exciting time, and I think that in 20 years, AI will be unrecognizable from what it is today. And I think those ethical concerns should be guiding principles throughout to ensure. I saw there's a really good question about criminal system having an overrepresentation of Indigenous and Black people. And I think we need to be extremely cognizant of those concerns, but we shouldn't let those concerns hamstring the development of AI. Perfection is desirable, but we shouldn't let the perfect obstruct the good.
Thanks. Greg?
If I can find the button on my phone. I agree, and I think I wanted to address that question that was in the chat as well with the bias of the technology. It is there, especially if it is using the case law, for example, that exist, or is using patterns that are developed by humans. That the AI will also adopt that. I think there's issues with the black box aspect of it, that any information that is gleaned out of artificial intelligence should, the person that's presenting that should be able to answer, well, how exactly did you come up with this? And if they cannot answer that, then I think then that would question whether or not that information is reliable. But again, I think that we are, I don't even think we're at the end of the beginning of AI in the law. We may be approaching that, but I think it's something that every year you will see some advancement that just wows you, and it's just going to be a part of the legal industry going forward.
Great. Paul-Erik?
I'll if you, Lachlan and Greg have just reacted to the bias point, and let me just say this very quickly. I agree with all of that, and the training a machine on an inappropriate subset of data or data that reflects a bias, if you're then using that to determine outcomes, is extremely problematic. But I think data can be used to identify exactly where those biases exist and actually help control for them, right? I think AI tools actually have the promise of showing and reinforcing exactly why the system is biased in the way it is, and we can only possibly correct something once we have the data that shows that there's a problem, and that's something that all of these tools can help us do. So absolutely there's problems, but I think the techniques we have also provide us a path to the solution to address all of those problems. So I too am optimistic.
Angela?
We have huge problems in the legal world, if you like. And obviously anything that will help resolve those problems is to be encouraged. For example, we have things like the what's called the Civil Resolution Tribunal in BC, which deals with a small subset of problems in condos and things like that. We could expand that in Ontario. All kinds of things. But my major concern is we have to do that in the context characterized, first place, by a lawyer's ethical obligations and professional obligations, and secondly, in the context judicial process, which puts constraints on the process. It reflects the values we have with the process, and we tamper with those, I think, at our peril. So we have to do it. AI helps. I'm all in favor of it. I'm just concerned that if we don't do it properly, we'll cause more problems than we solve.
Great. And Shelby?
Thanks so much. First of all, thanks for having me today. Guys, I'm going to take this in a slightly different direction. As a former young litigator who became a technologist who does this all the time, I just think we're at such a hopeful moment where people who only considered one career may have a whole wide array of opportunities in front of them with the advent of technology enriching sort of our legal lives. In addition, I think we're at a proud moment for Canada where we are the 5th largest source of talent in the world and punching way above our weight in this space, as I think Greg said. We are in an exciting field, in an exciting place, at an exciting time. And so I would say there is no question my commitment toward responsible and ethical AI is absolute. I think you'll see that we, all of us on the panel, are incredibly engaged around these topics and ensuring that we hit the right note. No one is suggesting that AI should be ubiquitous, but I think we have tons and tons of runway and tons of angles that we haven't even thought of yet. So, for those who were like me, who were once or are young litigators in the crowd, who, 15, 20 years later have taken their career in a totally different turn, I would just welcome that approach here and just know that we are in, a really transitional and amazing point in our journey here.
That's great. Well, we will have to leave it there. Thank you to all of you for such a lively, dynamic conversation. Thank you to the audience for joining us. And we will be in touch with everybody offline with a link to the recording and to follow up. Thank you again.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Eric. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.